Absolutely. Well, Nazreen, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights. It's always great chatting to you. That was Nazreen van der Westhuizen, Client Lead, South and Central Africa Regions for Global Markets at Standard Bank Group. Next up, the South African Venture Capital and Private Equity Association today published its 23rd annual Private Equity Industry Survey, and they found that 19.6 billion rands in funds were raised during 2022, growing by 21% from funds raised in 2021. This presents a sharp contrast to the global fundraising landscape, where they saw a 13% decline. I'm joined by Tshepiso Kobile, CEO at SAVCA. Thank you so much for joining us today. Curious just to get your take. I'm sensing quite a bit of optimism in terms of sentiment towards the South African venture private equity space. But what would you say were the main factors and drivers that are fueling this sentiment?
Good afternoon, Tanya, and thank you for having me on the show. Absolutely. I think you are quite right that we are seeing a lot of optimism in this space. And I think that optimism really is fueled by a number of things. We have seen that with the numbers that have come through this year, there's good growth in the fundraising activity, which is quite in contrast to what we are seeing globally. Also added to that, if one looks at what's happening within the exit environment, which is also quite important, of course, for private equity, we've seen a lot of our fund managers starting to return capital to investors, which of course bodes well for investor confidence. There are a number of areas, of course, where we've seen some alignment between what's happening locally and global trends. We, for example, have heard from our fund managers that there's concerns around potential global recession, and there's also some concerns around geopolitical tensions. But I think in the whole, while there was that alignment in some areas with what's happening globally, it was quite clear that there's some areas as well that set the Southern African region apart.
And from an exit perspective, curious to get your insights in terms of flows from exit activity, because that's also something that we saw on a global landscape that has been experiencing quite a few shocks, let's call it this way. What's it looking like from a South African perspective?
So what we've seen, if we perhaps start off with fundraising, is that, as you mentioned, we saw those numbers go up. In fact, they've rebounded to what we saw around 2019, which is quite exciting. And perhaps if one maybe unpacks that a little bit to try and understand what really made up that increase in fundraising. A lot of the funds that were really raised by the larger PE firms. By larger, we mean the ones that, for example, are managing in excess of 5 billion funds under management. But that is by value. What was quite exciting to see as well is that when one looks at the number of fund managers that were really active and raising capital, we saw that a big number of those were actually small to medium-sized funds. So that is quite exciting. If one looks at the composition of where those funds came from, about half of the funds came from international sources, with 49% being from local sources. That is, of course, a trend that we as SAVCA would like to see reversed, because given the current macroeconomic context, we feel that there is a strong need to really get local pension funds with their more patient capital, giving more exposure and allocation into the sector.
What would be needed to attract more funding locally into the venture capital and private equity space? Because you talk about patient capital, but what we have heard quite a bit is also the lack of risk capital on the market. Curious to get your take on this.
Absolutely. And I think that's really what sets private equity as an asset class apart, because we are talking about in fund managers that really avail that risk capital to SMEs. For example, if one looks at where the funds that have been raised are being deployed, it's mainly towards growth, the growth of SMEs. So we really see private equity as a great conduit for driving that growth. That is quite different, of course, to what is seen in other markets, where one tends to see a lot of activity within the buyout sector, whereas here it's actually growth and expansion capital. What we also saw from a investment activity point of view was that a substantial portion of the funds that were being invested were actually into infrastructure as well as energy and related. I think, in fact, collectively, they accounted for just over 50%. So I guess that can also be expected if one considers that, firstly, there is a need at the moment to invest into those sectors that offer inflation protection and that are counter-cyclical. And also what we've seen is, given the type of funding sources that are really largely international DFIs, etc., who tend to favor your larger fund managers who are investing also outside of our borders. What we've seen is that a substantial portion of that infrastructure investment also was outside of South Africa.
So I'm being told I've got 1 minute, so I'm going to try and get this, I'm going to try and pose my question as directly as I can. Your outlook for next year, what do you expect to see from a VC and private equity perspective?
We're absolutely optimistic. I think the survey has helped us to see that South African PE is really putting their foot forward. There's a lot of optimism around deal activity that's expected, as well as the size of funds that are going to be raised. And we're also expecting that with the recent Regulation 28 amendments, that are really increasing thresholds towards private equity, that will start to see more allocations being made towards the private sector. So what we are hoping to see in the next year and next couple of years is we would like to see more portfolios starting to include alternative investments, and more specifically PE and VC.
Well, we definitely love to hear more as the year progresses. Thank you so much for joining us today. That was Tshepiso Kobile, CEO at the South African Venture Capital